There is a story in the Old Testament that, if I'm being honest with you, it is what I would consider the most disturbing story in the entire Bible, and it could very well even be considered
X-rated.
So, before you watch this video, I want to make sure that you know that this video is not suitable for everyone of all ages, and it could very well trigger some sort of trauma from your past. The story that I'm referring to is actually found in Judges chapters 19 through 21. And many people are familiar with Judges chapter 19, but they don't actually read the rest of the story. And I believe that there are several key lessons that you and I need to learn from such a disturbing story. And first and foremost, I'm going to tell you the story. I'm going to retell it for you as dramatically as I can. And then I'm going to dig into the lessons I think you and I can learn. Join with me in Judges chapter 19, verse 1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a Levite staying in a remote part of the hill country of Ephraim acquired a woman from Bethlehem in Judah as his concubine. So I want you to set up the idea. Here is a Levite man who is living in the northern portion of Israel, and he acquires this woman to be his concubine or his wife, or whatever you want to call her, and she is living down south in Bethlehem. Now let's keep going. But she was unfaithful to him and left him for her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. She was there for 4 months. So she had an affair on him. She cheated on him. She went back home to live with her father in Bethlehem. So the story goes on. Essentially, this Levite man wants to get his wife back. So he basically travels from where he's living in the hill country of Ephraim all the way down south to Bethlehem to retrieve this woman to be with him once again. Hey guys, I know you're in the middle of watching a video, but check this out. I'm so very excited, guys. Listen, my book is out now, officially out. It's called MISLED, 7 Lies That Distort the Gospel and How You Can Discern the Truth. In this book, I highlight what I believe are the 7 top, most destructive, most harmful false teachings that many Christians are being deceived by, and the sad thing is they don't even realize it. So click the link below so you can pick up a copy of this book so that you can sharpen your discernment so that you are no longer vulnerable and you'll be able to discern truth from error. Okay, go ahead and get a copy of the book. Click the link below. Back to the video. So he gets there and her father is very, very hospitable. And several times the guy's like, hey, I got to go. All right, give me my wife. Let me go back home. And the father's like, no. You can stay another night. And he says, okay, I'll stay another night. And then he says, he gets up in the morning and says, hey, I got to go home. And the father's like, no. It's getting late. Stay another night. And this happened like for several days. And eventually the dude was like, hey, bro, look, with all due respect, I appreciate your hospitality, but I got to go. I got to get back home. So can you release me, right? And eventually the guy is on his way back home. And this is where all of the tragedy occurs. Because here this man is, he's with his concubine, and he's traveling from Bethlehem, which is in the southern part of Israel, all the way to the north of Ephraim. And so we'll pick up the story here. Verse 11 says, when they were near Gibeah and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, please, why not let us stop at this Jebusite city and spend the night here? But his master replied to him, we will not stop at a foreign city where there are no Israelites. Let's move on to Gibeah. So here his servant is like, hey, it's getting late. We need to spend the night somewhere. Why don't we stop here in this city? And this guy is like, nah, it's not safe here because there's no Israelites here. I don't know what these people are going to do to me. So let's see if we can make it a little bit further and travel a little bit further down the road so we can get to Gibeah, because at least in Gibeah, I know we'll be taken care of, because there it's a city of Benjamin. It's of the tribe of Benjamin. And there are some of our people there, and they will be able to take care of us and make sure that nothing happens to us. So he thought. Verse 13 says, come on, he said, let's try to reach one of those places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah. So they continued on their journey, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. So they go there, and to their surprise, nobody is willing to take them into their home. And hospitality was a huge thing in the Israelite culture. And then at the end of the night, this old man comes out to the square, if you can imagine this. And he says, hey, why are you still here? Has anybody taken you into their home? And they're like, nah, man, look, nobody's taken us in. And he says, hey, you know what? You can stay with me for the night. And the Levite's like, hey, okay, that's great. And I just want to let you know, we don't need anything from you. Right? We've got all of our supplies. We got enough food for our donkeys. We got enough food for me and my concubine. We just need a place to lay our head. If you got me a pillow, that's all I need, right? And the old man's like, hey, no big deal. Okay, you can stay with me. We're cool. So this Levite man and his servant and his concubine are staying the night in this man's home in Gibeah. And then this happens. Verse 22 says, while they were enjoying themselves, all of a sudden, wicked men of the city surrounded the house and beat on the door. They said to the old man who was the owner of the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. Wow! Man, this is where the story takes a twist. There are some perverted men who are living in Gibeah. These are some Benjaminites. And they are going to this old man's house and they're like, hey, we know that you have a guest in your home. Bring him out so that all of us can have sex with him. Now notice what happens next. The owner of the house went out and said to them, please don't do this evil, my brothers. After all, this man has come into my house. Don't commit this horrible outrage. Here, let me bring out my virgin daughter and the man's concubine now. Abuse them and do whatever you want to them, but don't commit this outrageous thing against this man. Now, we'll deal with that a little bit later on in this video, but what happens next is unthinkable. It says in verse 25, but the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and took her outside to them. They raped her and abused her all night until morning. At daybreak, they let her go. Now this, my friend, is why I said this video could be considered X-rated and it could trigger some things from your past, because I want you to imagine here is a group of perverted men. And they are taking turns having sex with this woman. They are raping her all night long to the point where in the morning they finally let her go. And this is what happens to this sad, poor young lady. Early that morning, the woman made her way back, and as it was getting light, she collapsed at the doorway of the man's house where her master was. Can you imagine this? She is so worn down. She's so beaten up. She's been so abused all night by these men that she barely has enough strength to just crawl her way back to this man's house. And she just kind of collapses on the porch and she just lays out. Now, notice what happens next. It says here, when her master got up in the morning, opened the doors of the house and went out to leave on his journey, there was the woman, his concubine, collapsed near the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. Get up, he told her, let's go. But there was no response. The woman had been abused so much that she had died. Notice it says here, so the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. Now, what's going to happen next is very, very gruesome and sad, but it says this. When he entered his house, he picked up a knife, took hold of his concubine, cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and then sent her throughout the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw it said nothing like this has ever happened or has been seen since the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt until now. Think it over, discuss it, and speak up. This man took his concubine home, cut her up into 12 pieces, and undoubtedly attached a letter to each piece of his deceased concubine and sent a different piece of her body to the 12 tribes of Israel with a letter telling them exactly what had been done by their own brothers, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. And when these other tribes saw and read what had happened to this woman, they said, wow, nothing like this has ever happened throughout our history. Now, there's a lot more to the story in chapters 20 and 21, so I want you to hold on. But this is where I want to start looking at some lessons that we can learn from this. And the first lesson is this: when there is no accountability in our lives, we have a strong tendency to drift. Notice Judges chapter 19, verse 1. We read it earlier, but I'm going to read it again. In those days when there was no king in Israel. You see, when you and I don't have anyone to answer to, when there's no fear that we have to explain ourselves or to be accountable to anyone else for our decisions and our actions, my friend, we are more prone to make poor decisions because we think that we can make these decisions in isolation without having to answer to anyone else. And this is exactly what was happening in Israel. There was no king, there was no law, or at least there was a law, but people weren't upholding the law. It wasn't being enforced. And so as a result, what happened? They ended up doing something that they probably never thought they would do. The second mini lesson that I want to talk about is make sure that we are treating every single human being as an image bearer of God. Here is this man, and he said, you know what? It would be wrong for you to do what you want to do to this man, but you can do whatever you want to do to my daughter and his concubine. His mentality was that this man's life and this man's virtue was worth more than his own daughter and this man's concubine. We have to make sure, and this is the reason why watching inappropriate websites and things of that nature, we need to make sure we don't do that. If you want to stop watching stuff online that you know you shouldn't be watching, and you know what I'm talking about, I want you to see every single girl that you're looking at as an image bearer of God, as someone, your daughter. Imagine if you would want someone looking at your daughter doing the things that you're seeing on the screen. But here's the third and probably the most important lesson that I want to highlight in this video. The further you and I drift away from God, the more vulnerable we are to doing things that we never imagined we would do. You see, when you look at the book of Judges as a whole, what you will see is a nation of people who have been slowly drifting away from God. They have been slowly backsliding. And what you see happening in Judges chapters 19 through 21 is the culmination of drifting away from God. And it shows just how far away the nation as a whole had drifted from God. And my friend, you and I are no different, because if we don't stay in close connection with God, if we drift away from God, if we backslide from God, this is when we, like the Israelites, will find ourselves doing things that somebody 10 years before would have tried to tell us that we would do, and we would be convinced that there's no way that we would be able to do these things. There's no way that I would be divorced. There's no way that I would have an affair. There's no way that I would be kicked off from my job because they found me watching something online. There's no way that I'd be smoking weed or whatever it is. Whatever you think in your mind that there's no way you could do, the further you drift away from God, the more prone and more vulnerable you are to actually committing that sin. Now, the story does not end in chapter 19. I wish it did, but it actually gets worse. Because what happens now in chapter 20 is there is a civil war between the 11 tribes of Israel, and they're fighting against the one tribe of Benjamin, because it's the Benjamin tribe that performed this outrageous, heinous act of sin on one of their own fellow Israelite brothers. So I want to encourage you to read in detail Judges chapters 20 and 21. But to make a long story short, there is this huge battle. Thousands and thousands of lives were lost as a result of this battle on both sides. And what ends up happening is that there are only 600 Benjamite men that are left. And so in chapter 21, the other 11 tribes start to feel bad or start to feel pity for the tribe of Benjamin, because they basically are afraid that this tribe of Benjamin is going to be extinct, because there's 600 men who are alive, but there's no women of Benjamin for them to get married and procreate with. And so now they have another problem, because now they're worried that one of their 12 tribes of Israel is going to be extinct. So now this leads to my fourth lesson. Every poor decision that we make has consequences that we cannot choose. Although what these Benjamite people did was wrong, The other 11 tribes coming and actually fighting and killing them was a decision that they made, and now they have to pay for the fallout of that decision. And the Benjamites also have to pay for the fallout of their poor decision as well. Listen, you can choose your sin, but you can't choose your consequences. Every decision that you make has consequences. And the thing is, guys, you and I don't get to choose those types of consequences. So what happens is this. These Israelites go and slaughter men from this clan called Jabesh Gilead. And they slaughter these men, and there's 400 women who have never been with a man. So they take those 400 women and they give those 400 women to 400 of the 600 Benjamite men for those Benjamite men to procreate. But what's the problem? Simple math. There were 600 Benjamite men who were not able to find wives because all the wives have been murdered and killed. And 400 of them have now had a wife given to them from this Jabesh Gilead tribe or clan, if you will. So the problem is now there's 200 men of Benjamin who do not have wives. And this is why I said that one poor decision oftentimes follows another, because what happens next is that these Israelites are basically saying, you know what? We all took an oath and we said that we could not give our daughters to any of the Benjamites, but it doesn't say anything about if they're taken. So now what happens is they have to make another poor decision, and they say, hey, you know what? This is what the Benjaminites need to do. They send a message. They say, hey, look, there's a festival coming up. There's a feast coming up. And essentially, there's going to be some of our daughters who are going to be dancing and hanging out at this feast. Now, we can't technically give you our daughters because we took an oath. But you know what? If you find them and you kidnap them, then that's on you. If you find them and kidnap them, then we're free from this oath because we didn't technically give them to you, and you'll be able to have a wife and you'll be able to fulfill and be able to procreate. So they have this feast, and essentially these Benjamite men, the 200 Benjamite men, go and steal and kidnap these women while they are dancing at a feast, and they take them back as their wives. Now, guys, I know this is a crazy story and I tried to sum it up as quickly as I could, but the point is this: one poor decision oftentimes leads to another, and all sorts of bad decisions affect other people. Go through this story again and look at how many people were negatively affected by a poor decision. Some of the Benjamite men deserved what happened to them, but most of the people in Benjamin had nothing to do with it, and they died in battle. The Jabesh Gilead people, they died as well. The women were then taken away from their land and given to these Benjamites. And then these other women were then kidnapped by the Benjamite men and taken away from their families. And all this happened because of poor decisions. But here's the fifth and final lesson I want to encourage you with today. And that's the fact that God has grace for us even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. Notice how the book of Judges ends. It says here, the Benjaminites did this and took the number of women they needed from the dancers they caught. They went back to their own inheritance, rebuilt their cities, and lived in them. At that time, each of the Israelites returned from there to his own tribe and family. Each returned from there to his own inheritance. And then, of course, the last verse in the book of Judges characterizes and describes the entire book of Judges. It says here, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. My friend, even though God was gracious to allow this tribe of Benjamin to rebuild and populate and not go to extinction, there were consequences to their decisions. And if there's not anything else you get out of this video, I want to encourage you to understand that every single decision you and I make have consequences, oftentimes consequences that cannot even be measured and consequences that we cannot choose. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.